Martin, how you doing?
I'm all right, thank you. Yes.
Looking at the passage we have for this Sunday, Luke 18, 1 to 8, the parable of the persistent widow and the unjust judge. This widow that nags this judge for her to be given justice over her opponent, about which issue we don't know much else. But what do you make of this?
So I go back to a sort of framing that and I've talked about before, in terms of how do we understand why Luke has got these stories and how he tells them in the particular way that he tells them. Why has he retained these particular stories from Jesus, and what was the purpose? And well, for me, if I think of those in those terms, I'm thinking then about what was the church, what was going on for Luke's church, that these were important resonant stories, why they're kind of connected, they made sense. And if you think then, Luke is really keen on cities. This is set in a city. There's no reference to the synagogue or the temple. The judge is a civil judge, not a religious judge, and he is described and then describes himself as no respecter of God or of persons.
Yeah, no fear of God or respect of persons. Yeah,
and exactly the opposite of loving God and loving your neighbour. So this is clearly setting a scene for a context that is antipathetic, if not hostile. And the widow, who in Luke's language, and we see this in both in, say, the story of the widow's mite, or reference to widows in Acts. Widows are the poor, and yet they are generous, they're diligent, they're persistent. The widow seeking for the mite. They also are those who have a special place for which the community, the Christian community, has a particular care for.
yeah.
And so if you kind of put that together, there's a sense in which the widow represents the church, the small, fragile, precarious, vulnerable, but needing to be treasured Christian congregation in a context which is hostile. So I mean, that's the kind of scene that I see in that. And then the question is, and it's interesting that we've got the persistence of the widow, the eventual relenting of this unjust judge, and then right at the end of the passage, when the Son of Man returns, will he find faith? So there are questions going on in this community's mind about why do we not see God at work in the way that why are these things not happening? Why is this not happening? Why is this happening to us? And where's God? So that sense of, which is completely familiar to us, of wondering what God is up to. It seems like it's a long time. We keep having to ask, we keep praying, and nothing happens. And the question in the Luke has at the Jesus at the end reports Jesus saying is, will faith persist? How long can we go on without the evidence of God's active presence? And the story is saying, just like the unjust judge, God will answer, but you have to wait. You have to persist. You absolutely have to persist. And that's my sense. Does that make sense? And I suppose I put it in the times we're in. I mean, we pray every day for peace in Ukraine. We pray at the moment every day for some common sense in the government. And we pray those prayers in the absolute conviction that somehow, somewhen, God will answer.
Mm. Yeah. So, what else to say? Let's have a little bit more context. So the widow, she is a woman, and therefore, in the strictures of the day, she would certainly not be allowed to approach a judge. She would not actually be allowed in a public venue, and she would not be allowed to talk to strangers, and she would have to go out doubly veiled. So presumably, so people like Kenneth Bailey would say, she is heckling.
Mm-hmm.
She's heckling this judge, yeah, from a distance or something. And when the judge says, oh, because of her consistent bothering of me, the word for bothering is receiving blows under your eye.
It's giving you a black eye, I think.
Yeah. So in other words, and if you take that for what it means, then if you were to come in here with two black eyes, I think my first question would be, who's giving you the black eyes, Martin?
May not be your first question.
Or did you win? Might be.
That's
my
right. Yes.
first question.
What's the state of the other guy?
So in other words, there's something here about it's not only persistence. There's real grit, isn't there, in here, and real iron. But one of the dangers with this parable, though, is that it suggests, if you translate the judge to be God, that immediately you've got this idea that God is kind of like in need of being persuaded of the good. Mm-hmm. And that seems to me entirely inappropriate. Now, you have got in Romans and places like this push on being earnest and being persistent in prayer. So it's not that you've not got that, but how can you reconcile the fact we have a good God, a God who is consistently good, with this idea of persisting in prayer? Well, are you going to answer?
I was going to. Yeah, and part of the problem is you take a parable and you try and get parallels in the parable, which isn't the point of a parable.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a danger. So this is not to be interpreted as if you nag God enough, you'll get what you want from God. That is not the way to interpret this parable, which incidentally makes me think of the interesting question of when have we prayed enough? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When have we prayed enough? I think sometimes, like, if we've had a Eucharist and prayed through the Eucharist for something, and for like say an interview for somebody. So we've had a Eucharist in the morning, and then we're interviewing, and we prayed there, and then somebody says, "Well, can we pray?" And you're thinking, we spent an hour praying. Now, I've nothing against more prayer, but haven't we prayed already? Yeah. And Agnes Sanford, the faith healer, for instance, she talks about how once you've prayed to God for healing, well, the last thing you do is you pray again for the healing, because you trust that you trust faithfully. What you do then is you thank God. Mm-hmm. You thank God and you thank God and you thank God every day. You don't stop praying, but your prayer is then different. So anyway, but that's to one side about the interesting question about when prayer is enough. But Frank Laubach, in his little book on prayer, has an interesting way of explaining the persistence in prayer. He says that prayer isn't trying to convince God to be good. God is already good, and God is already doing God's best. But prayer is the arrangement in this world of ours for us to join in with God's power. In the same way that a single ray of sunshine doesn't warm the world and a single drop of rain doesn't water the earth, we need to be praying in order to enable people to be open to and responsive to the grace that is always forthcoming. So it's an interesting way of looking at the way in which we're participating in the power of God, and actually have remarkable possibilities within prayer for opening up the world to God's grace. Mm-hmm. Anyway, but the last point, and probably the most important point for me, is when Jesus at the end says, having given this example, he talks about, and will not God give justice to his chosen ones? Now, the word chosen there is only used in one other place in Luke, and it's used at Luke 23:35, when they are mocking Jesus on the cross as the chosen one. Yeah? But will justice be done? The justice that we see being done through the cross and the death and the resurrection is new life. So when Jesus says at the end, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? I'm wondering if that isn't about find those who trust that in and through failure and brokenness and even death, resurrection life comes. Will he find that sort of trust around? The kind of trust you saw in Stephen, who even as he's stoned to death is praying to God. The kind of trust that you see in the Algerian monks who prayed for their the Islamic terrorists even as they martyred them, or Cyprian of Carthage as he's martyred, praying Deo gratis. We see this faith, but will we see it? This faith that believes that out of death comes life as we trust in the one who pioneered that.